Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. We're going to be chatting about leveling up your IT budget, designing for both accountability and impact. We have a lot of actionable budgeting tips and tricks to share with you today, but before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to cover as everybody continues to trickle in. So first, we will aim to run about 45 minutes today with a few minutes for questions at the end. This webinar is being recorded and you will get a copy of the recording and the slides after the event. And lastly, attendees are in listen-only mode, but there is a Q&A function and I encourage you to submit all your questions as we go. We'll try and get to a few of those at the end. With that, I'd like to introduce you to our expert today. We are joined by Tara Bartels. She is the manager of advisory services at Dataprise. She has many years of experience advising customers through intricate technology roadmaps and budgeting processes, and she's going to share that experience with us today. My name is Stephanie Hamrick. I am a marketing manager at Dataprise, and I will be your moderator along the way. So I'll give a brief intro to Dataprise for those who don't know us, and then we will get right into the content. So Dataprise is a national managed services provider. We've been providing services end-to-end for our customers since 1995. We have customers and offices all across the United States. Our mission is that technology should help you be better at what you do. And so our goal is to deliver best-in-class managed cybersecurity, network, infrastructure, collaboration, and end user solutions to help you get there. That brings us to our agenda for the day. We will talk briefly about some common obstacles that may be causing frustration in your budgeting processes. Then we'll get to the good stuff. We'll cover how to prepare for a successful budgeting process, some key considerations for pulling your data sources and putting your budget together. And then we'll end with a few tips on successful budget presentations. So let's talk about those frustration drivers. Tara, do you want to talk about what is working against IT leaders when they're trying to put their budget together?
Absolutely, sure. So there is frustration. I'm sure that anyone who's worked in IT has felt it or has been on the other side of the department interacting with IT. They might have also felt it. Um, it comes primarily from these three areas. So number one, which we see most common, is that IT usually has an indirect relationship to revenue. Usually, sales organizations or, even marketing might sometimes have a much easier justification because the things that they are tying their activities to is directly tied to revenue. That's not always the case with IT. So it is a little more difficult to demonstrate that IT activity is impacting revenue. There's also, of course, departmental competition. There's only so much money to go around. Everyone is vying for that purse, and it can only be divided so many ways. So there's going to be that natural competition between departments. And then the third area, which can be a stumbling point, is IT's relationship to overall business strategy. There can be that disconnect if you're not careful. So many times an IT department gets stuck in the conversation of, defending what people see them as a cost center when really they are a value driving part of the company. So when you're only seen as a cost center, you get a little bit pigeonholed. So it's important to focus on strategy. So those are some very common budgeting frustrations.
Awesome. And I'm sure those frustrations are maybe a little bit too painfully familiar to our audience here today. So let's switch it up here and talk about how we can eliminate some of that friction. And that starts before budgeting season, right? There are some strategic ways you can set yourself up to have success in budgeting before actual budgeting season rolls around, which
Mhm.
may represent a shift from how many people feel about budgeting, which is that it's this chore that comes around, it's a checkbox you check, and then you move on and you hope to not think about it until next year. But Tara, can you talk about the importance of tying your budget more closely to your strategy
Mhm.
and thinking about it in a different way?
Absolutely. So ideally, you're preparing for next year's budget all year long, because you want the buy-in for those different items throughout the year leading up. It can be a little bit much to all of a sudden, when it's time to submit the budget, people are viewing all these things for the very first time. That can lead to delays and denials, or very in-depth discussions, if actually goes well, and then they're actually considering adopting your suggestions. So you don't want to start and stop during budgeting season. You do want to make sure that your budget is aligned throughout the year as well, with what you're actually doing within your department. So it should also be your guide. If you're going above or below budget, that's just some opportunities to improve for next year.
Awesome. So we're starting to think about our budget more strategically. What actions should we take to set ourselves up for success when budgeting season does come around?
Absolutely. So, like I said, alluded to at least on the last slide, there shouldn't be many surprises by the time you submit your budget. If there is something new, be prepared to defend it. So, how do you do that? Well, you have to know your stakeholders. You have to know your audience, the people that you're speaking to. You may be thinking a particular way about your IT spend throughout the year because you're really embedded in it. But for example, if we're talking about things like data center costs, be prepared to lose your stakeholders' attention after a certain amount of time. So you want to try to remember that the people that are listening to your budget arguments are not in the trenches with you day to day. So you need to constantly be putting it in business terms by knowing your stakeholders. You want to know the way different expenses are categorized. So let me spend a second on that. So your CFO or your leadership may have certain desires with the way you spend money. So there may be a certain amount of money, but they may want to see it, largely reflected in CapEx, capital expenditures versus OpEx, because it depends on the future of that company. So they may have their own preferences in the way that those expenses are booked. So you want to make sure that you're having that kind of discussion. You do want to touch base with those stakeholders prior to budget submission, hopefully in the months leading up to it, because you want to know their views, their biases, their insights. That way you can a little bit cater to that and you can solve for that. So if there's always been sensitivity around a certain issue, you want to know that. You want to know that way ahead of time. That way you can prepare for that. And then, of course, the pre-selling of your priorities. So by the time you're submitting the budget, right, the numbers are all associated with what you're doing. Ideally, in the run up through the year, you're selling the ideas, the priorities, absent the budget, right? So if you think that you can best support your business strategy by by encouraging or fostering a really good remote workforce, those are points you want to hammer in throughout the year. That way, when it comes to some investments that are required to support that, you can lead it back to and say, hey, I know this is a business priority. I know you agree with me on the business priority. So here are the items that associate to that outcome. That way, it's not out of left field or not connected to that business goal.
Awesome. And that sounds like it takes some of the stress out of it, right? If you're having these conversations in advance, budgeting season doesn't feel like this brand new thing where you have to stress about things that haven't been talked about, where your priorities haven't been aligned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's get into some of these budgeting considerations, steps, tips, and tricks that can help IT leaders while they're putting their budget together. And our first section here is going to be gathering key data sets. So, Tara, what data should IT leaders gather, and what are those key essential calculations and insights that they should be making at this step?
Sure. So ideally, you have previous year's budgets. Sometimes you might have to hunt them down, but at a minimum, have the previous year's IT budget. Then you want to line it up with what your actual spend is, and that can take also a little bit of homework depending on how the books are being kept. You might have to touch base with finance, look at invoices that came in, check those service agreements in order to compare what the actuals were. And remember to check for those overage charges that inevitably came from some vendor. You want to be able to factor in if there was any overrun. And then, of course, you want to take a look at your current expenses. So, the easiest thing to keep an eye on, right, are your contracts for managed services, any hardware that you're consistently having to buy, such as computers for your staff, and professional services, because sometimes professional services are a little bit left out. People will know, hey, I need to budget for spending, X amount of dollars on, like I said, new computers. But if you don't factor in the cost to configure those, like let's say you don't have it automated and it actually takes someone touching it, that's an important part of the cost that you've left out. So you want to make sure that you've accounted for all the areas of cost for what you're currently doing. Something else is that you want to have a little bit of a narrative around how you got to where you are today in your budget and what you've spent so far. Sometimes what happens at this stage is you'll have your business leader check in and say, wow, we're really spending that much money on XYZ. So yeah, a part of that conversation may be reminding them, yes, because last year, don't forget, we deferred this important upgrade project. So we've been dealing with those cost overruns, trying to maintain an older environment. So just be able to keep pace with them and anticipate those natural questions that they're going to have as to how a number got to be so high or how an expense kind of dwindled down. Again, this is a narrative, this is a conversation. Yeah, a lot of it winds up in a spreadsheet, but remember that this is a conversation. The other parties at the table are just looking to understand. That's it. So you're just helping them understand.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that you call it a narrative. You
Mhm,
are telling a story about what you're doing with IT and what you're enabling.
mhm,
And as you're gathering data to help inform your spend, you should also be gathering some data to help you make your case on the approvability side. So take the time to review and highlight your cost control wins. This might feel like homework, but you're going to want to list specific cost control initiatives and the goals that you had when you set out those initiatives. And of course,
mhm,
the results. And that's going to help you in two ways, as again, like you said, as you were telling this story, as you're laying out this narrative.
mhm,
So first, you're going to demonstrate your trustworthiness. You're going to demonstrate that IT is fiscally responsible and engender some goodwill and hopefully some flexibility and trust from your CFO. And also, this is going to help you move the conversation forward. So instead of getting into the weeds, spending time talking about all these tactical line items, you can get that out of the way. We can check the box, IT is fiscally responsible, and start focusing on those more strategic conversations that you want to be having. You want to be having those conversations about reallocating saved funds to other initiatives, and you can
mhm,
prove that you've made space for it.
mhm. Absolutely.
Awesome. And so you're collecting all of this data. One piece of data you may feel like you also need to collect that we haven't talked about yet is peer benchmarks or industry
Mhm.
benchmarks. Tara, do you want to talk about maybe some trouble that we might get into if we rely too much on these
Yes.
things?
Yeah, we get asked about industry benchmarks all the time, and we do our best to meet that need. We do have a tremendous research partner that can help us with that, but we always attach it with a caution, which is don't base your spend based on industry benchmarks for your sector, or worse, just companies at large, regardless of their sector. It's a little bit like looking at your neighbor and saying, well, I'm going to spend how much they're spending. I mean, really though, it's not to say that they're spending correctly, right? It's also not to say that their business goals are the same. For example, you could only imagine, right, that Google's percentage of revenue spent on IT innovation is going to be very, very, very different than a non-technology company. A nonprofit's spend, even within the nonprofit vertical, is going to be different from one to another based on their priorities, based on the way that they measure and evaluate their programs, based on the mandates that come down to them through, any grantors that they have. So it's okay to be curious about benchmarks. Definitely seek them out as a point of interest because, yeah, your business leaders might be very curious to know. But always temper it with, we don't necessarily want to copy what our neighbor is doing. It's a little bit like you think of, like teenagers in class or something and kind of copying off your neighbor. Well, who's to say that those
Hmm.
answers are right? You might be copying them, but it could be the wrong answer. So I would just say be cautious of that. But there is research out there where you can absolutely find benchmark information typically based on percentage of revenue.
Awesome. And not to keep bringing it back to the story thing, right? But you want to tell your own story with your budget and not your neighbor's story.
Right. Yeah. And also realize too that the way that one company characterizes their IT budget might be different than the way another company characterizes their IT budget. So one company may only be considering their IT budget the actual infrastructure of their IT, the switches, the servers, the computers, maybe the managed services contract. Um, but you might have the next company that has a more holistic view of what falls within an IT budget. Maybe it includes a lot more and includes all kinds of programmatic areas. Maybe most of their marketing tools, I mean, so much exists now as software, so much exists now as
Hmm.
service, where they might be capturing a lot more of it. So it can be a little bit misleading to say, well, this company spent this much on their IT. Sure, but like what was all included in that IT spend? So just be careful.
Yeah. So you've pulled the data you need, and as Tara just mentioned, hopefully you're keeping a good mix of data in mind and not relying too much on one type of data or category. Now it's time to start putting the numbers down, making some forecasts. Tara,
Mhm.
can you talk about how IT leaders might go about starting this process?
Absolutely. So there are going to be some non-negotiables or close to it on an annual basis. So that's going to be something like your multi-year contracts. Most service providers love to get you into a multi-year contract, and there is benefit to doing that. That spend on an annual basis for that contract term will be about the same. But something else you also need to just take a pulse on is that even within a multi year contract, there can very likely be an escalation built in every year. So, what your spend was on that multi year contract in year one might not be the same exact cost in year two. You've got to go back to that contract and take a look at any escalation costs that are built into that because it's very, very likely that there is. So you want to take a look at that because it's also not a great time to go back to your service provider and start saying, hey, I actually only
Hmm.
budgeted for year one, not year two. They're going to hold up the contract and say, yeah, but you signed this. So it can get into a little bit of an issue. And we'll talk more about that in later slides about how that is sometimes resolved, but then something you got to look for there. Um, you also want to take a look at, like we said before, your OPEX and your CAPEX spending targets. Make sure you understand what those targets are, what those strategies are from the business. I'm going to give you an example. So, if you are a company that is preparing to sell, maybe you are looking to be purchased by a larger company or by some outside finance. Typically speaking, you want your OPEX to be as low as is reasonable. Your CAPEX, there's a little more wiggle room because those can be any kind of improvement projects. There are some gray areas, especially when you're talking about professional services, under which bucket that could fall under. So, one example is part of the work that I do in advisory services. Um, if we are contracted as a project where we are putting in place new frameworks, new governance, and it's part of achieving some kind of compliance objective that you're now newly seeking, that can fall under one category. However, if you decide instead that you just want to expand your managed services contract by adding more time with a strategic advisor, that's going to usually show up under your OPEX costs. And that might paint a different picture than you're actually intending to paint. So you do want to make sure that if you do have an increased need for professional services and it is going on the back of what is usually an OPEX spend, make sure you're having that conversation with your budget approvers, because they might have some creative ideas or just different points of view on where that falls that you might not have thought of. And you want to make sure that you're taking that into account. So you do want to have your most likely scenario forecast, and then understand that there just might be a little bit of wiggle there. You also want to explore some alternative scenarios, right? Ideally, things look exactly the way you intended when you submitted the budget. That's it. There's been no changes. It was perfect. I love it. Okay. That's not always the way it goes. So you do want to be prepared for a little bit more of a nuanced conversation with your approvers about, well, what would it look like if we had to reduce costs by 10%? Don't be caught flat-footed in that meeting and say, well, I don't know. Make sure that you're having those different paths in the conversation in your own head ahead of time. If you're in a conversation where you think they're going to say, because there's somebody in the room that's going to say, well, what if we had to reduce costs by 10%? Have some ideas where, well, we could try to do this or maybe do this, but let me look more into it and get back to you. Look like you've already, not look like, but truly have already thought about it. Another area could be, hey, someone's saying to you, I realize that we haven't been investing as much as we wanted to in innovation. So what would it look like if we started really spending some strategic funds on innovation? What could that look like? So have a couple different scenarios in your head. Going back to previous slide, know who your stakeholders are, know who the approvers are, where they sit within things, and what kind of questions that they might have.
All right, so let's take some of those concepts and talk about a few real world examples. On the registration form for this session, we asked what each of you are currently budgeting for, and we combined that data into this chart. I know we said don't rely on too many benchmarks, but here we got some benchmarks for you. So you can see what's top of mind for other IT leaders. And Tara, we pulled out a few examples that we think might be top of mind here about how an IT leader might go about striking a balance between paying for these innovation projects versus just maintaining what they already have. Do you want to talk about that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that Stephanie and I had a little bit of a giggle this week because we were talking about how much great data that Stephanie was able to capture during registration of what people were budgeting for, and obviously showing you guys that data. And I was like, well, maybe this will scratch the itch of people's need to have some benchmarking. So here you go. Here's your benchmarking. But these are the types of things that people are budgeting for. You're going to see security is way up there, right? Security, everyone's always having an eye on the hardware refresh, so that was not unexpected to see that there. And we also saw that artificial intelligence is way up there as well. No surprise. In this past year, no surprise at all that more and more companies are trying to budget and plan for that. But of everything that you guys see here, you can see that a lot of this breaks up into what we could categorize as maintenance and some things that we could categorize as innovation, and where there is some crossover. And security is an area of crossover, I would think. So let's take one of these examples, because a lot of people seem to be interested in budgeting for AI. So knowing that that's definitely a pet topic lately, let's make that an example. So how do you budget for AI, right? What does that process look like? So it would be a pretty tricky sell to just have a random number and say, this is what we're budgeting for AI this year. Expect questions. But the things that you want to be prepared for are the use cases, right? So what are the ways that you're planning to use it? Always tie it back to that business reason. What's the problem you're trying to solve? Or what's the revenue opportunity that you're trying to address? Um, it could be efficiency, something as simple as efficiency, and that's okay. But again, you want to try to quantify that. If at any point you can tie it to revenue, tie it to revenue. That is the loudest, clearest argument that most people are able to hear is how you can associate it with revenue or dramatic cost savings. But it requires a little bit of work, right? Because even if you're saying, hey, if we invest, $50,000 in AI this year, be prepared for the conversation of, right, but what's the return on that investment, right? Are we going to see $100,000 worth of productivity efficiency in that same year? So be prepared to talk about what that ROI period looks like, when you're going to break even, when you're going to start to see those actual gains, and also have the data to facilitate that conversation. So some things you might going in the direction of efficiency gains, right? So be prepared to put together some arguments where maybe you've spoken to HR. Don't ask for anyone's specific salary, but hey, across the company, could you just give me like a blended rate that I could use that includes burden for like an hourly cost of staff, because I'm just doing this little project here. And they probably will. And at that point, you can take that and you can say to yourself, okay, well, if we use AI in the use case that we've imagined, and if hypothetically we're saying we could save people 1 hour a day across our user base of 100, 500 people, now you're able to start to build that financial argument as to why it's necessary. But also be prepared to have little caveats. It's like, here's where it could go wrong, right? And you also have to have a little more to it than that. You want to have a governance plan, because it's not really possible to just jump feet first into AI and have it be automatically successful. There's all kinds of things, just good housekeeping you need to have in place ahead of time. So you might have to do a data governance project. You might have to do an initiative around compliance and privacy to just understand how you're going to prepare yourself for AI. So there are all these other costs that are associated with your AI initiative. So that number might grow even larger than you thought. But try to put some thought into it. If you do have to just put a placeholder number, you're probably only going to find yourself in like a pilot situation this year, and that's okay. But for a full rollout, you want to be really prepared to justify what that looks like. I'm not saying that there's a ton. I don't want to speak broadly in one direction or the other. If there's successful AI implementations or most fail, I don't think that I have access to that data yet. But there's a lot of reasons why AI initiatives fail. So you do want to try to realize that anything that you're putting in this budget, that you're leaning into, that your name is attached to that, your credibility is attached to that. So if you don't have a plan for what you're going to do with AI, but you're requesting just this placeholder, just know that your credibility is on the line. So you have to be in lockstep with your approvers, with your business leaders, in understanding what the outcomes are and what the expectations are, and if there is room for failure, and hopefully there is, that it might not work out that year. Make sure you're on the same page and that you're not really presenting this overly optimistic picture of AI is going to solve all of our problems if we just spend $25,000 this year. Be careful. But that's some stuff that I would do for the AI scenario specifically.
Awesome. Let's talk about, oh, go ahead.
Well, let me just balance it out with the security one, because I think security is another one where what I see time and time again is that people are basing last year's cybersecurity related costs for budget for this year. And I caution against that. Something you have to be tuned into is that cybersecurity costs change year over year. And usually it's because bad actors, as we call them, the bad guys, their tactics change year over year and they become more sophisticated. And then so do the security solutions that then try to combat that. So security is also using a lot of AI these days. There's a lot going on in the area of cybersecurity. So You absolutely want to make sure that you're prioritizing your cybersecurity investment. Um, Something that you absolutely should have in the conversation is the cost of an incident, right, for your company, or the cost of a breach. What does that look like, right? So again, be prepared with how many hours of downtime for staff would that equate to? What potential regulatory fines would be involved with that? What about lawsuits? Um, that conversation is a little easier to balance. I know sometimes it can feel like a scare tactic, but honestly, it's not, because of just how frequent cyber attacks are these days. So there, hopefully I've put some out there for security, for AI, and everybody else, all those other categories, give me a call and I'll help you.
I like that.
Yeah.
All right, so part three here is putting everything together. You have all your calculations, your priorities, your assumptions, and now it's time to think again. I'm going to keep talking about this narrative, that story that you're telling with your budget and what it looks like as a whole picture. So I'll hand it over to you to talk about what that looks like.
Sure. Um, so again, you want to have rationales for the drivers of what you're doing. Ideally, your strategy is directly tied to the business strategy. You can't operate in a silo of all the great things you want to do. This is the company's money overall. So it has to tie back to that. Um, you do want to build credibility with all the things you're doing. So, the degree possible, always try to attach it to either qualitative or quantitative data. It's always really helpful. I mentioned before, there's a lot of great tools out there that can give you data. Make sure you're reading data and statistics correctly and that you're interpreting things correctly. The last thing you want to do is pull a piece of data, think it's telling the story that you want it to tell, but under closer scrutiny, the data is actually saying something else, because then that can just detract from your overall argument and it can detract from your credibility, and you don't want that. So just be careful with the data you're choosing and that you truly understand what that data is saying. Um, Always put it in a balanced conversation of risk or revenue. Those are some very important areas that resonate with most companies. So that's a good way to frame it. Um, if there are going to be large variances, either this year or even next year or the year after, it's good to flag that. Again, it's just that trustworthiness, that credibility. Hey, by the way, I realize that this really sticks out. Let's talk about it. It's not a surprise. I'm not trying to hide it from you by asking about how your pets are doing first. Like, this is something that I want to get out in the open and I want to get in front of, um, because credibility is important. And you want to work on those long-term relationships. It can be difficult if the people you're having this conversation with, you're only having this conversation with once a year when you submit the budget. That's tough. You want to maintain relationships with everybody involved. You want to know what their common complaints are and what they're really focused on. And to the degree possible, take that into account. But don't let budgeting conversations get derailed um, by someone getting off track. Sometimes people really do have a gripe about something in particular, and no matter how hard you try to steer the conversation, they always winds up talking about, but why is the cost of Azure so much? And it's like, okay, that can be difficult. So um, if you know someone's going to derail a conversation, maybe that derail topic, keep that towards the end. That way your whole budgeting conversation isn't blown in the first 5 minutes. And ask yourself, what are the recurring points of conflict between business unit leaders? So it requires a little bit of intel, a little bit of political finesse, a little bit of diplomacy, data gathering. Don't be intimidated by it. This is just putting names to the reality that's happening in front of you.
Awesome. And so that story that you're telling with your budget should be the same or very similar to the story that your business wants to tell about their trajectory and their
Mhm.
goals and what they want to achieve. How can you tie those two things together?
Sure. So anytime that you can attach, whether it's an OPEX or a CAPEX spend to a business goal, the better off you are, because you don't want to have any particular spend exist on its own on an island. If you can associate it with, for example, a better customer experience, that's terrific. If the corporate goal is to retain, this is an example. If a corporate goal that your company has is to retain customers, enhance that customer experience, get those customers to return to your business, and if that's the focus, then yeah, it makes it easier to say, here are the capital expenditures, the larger term projects and initiatives that support that. If we had to add on an OPEX costs, here's how's that, here's what that is. And then to the degree that you can, see if it has resulted in that, right? Are you retaining more customers at a corporate level? Has their experience been better? See if someone can push out some surveys around that. See if you have that data. Tie it to what you've done. Those are really compelling arguments.
And once you think you're done, you're still not done. You're going to want to make sure that you double check both your calculations and also the rationale that you have set up for each choice, and make sure that's aligned with your approvers and your business strategy. On the calculation side, it's just so important for your credibility that each number is exactly correct. You don't want your approval team to notice one mistake and then that causes them to call each detail into question, things that they wouldn't have questioned before. And then on the rationale side, you want to make sure that you're telling that right story again, that gets you the highest chance of approval. So taking this extra step to double check everything sounds exhausting after you've already been through an exhausting budgeting process, but this is going to set you up to ensure that every piece of your budget is defensible, it's credible, and also that it's compelling.
Mhm.
Which brings us to our last section of the day. We're going to leave you with some tips for successfully presenting your budget. So, Tara, what are some of the most important things to keep in mind when it comes to how you present your budget?
Sure. So overarching across everything you're seeing on this slide, narratives are important. There's this article that Harvard Business Review published out a while ago now, and it was all about the success of TED Talks and how to use those different techniques in your own presentations, right? And it said, like, here's what you have to do if you're presenting research, if you're presenting data, if you're presenting this. So I would encourage you to seek out that article. It's a good one. But the point is, narratives are hugely, hugely compelling. So try to work on a narrative, understand that you need to keep people's attention, keep them engaged, especially if it's someone that really only has about 15 minutes, 20 minutes to give to this. Keep your language neutral and objective. Don't get defensive. At this point, you really like the budget you've put together. You're really hoping to sell every line in that budget. Um, it might not happen that way, and that's okay because, as I always say, it's a business decision, right? It's a perfectly acceptable business decision. You might not agree with it, but it's a business decision. So avoid getting defensive. If the answer is no for any particular budget item, make sure that you take a beat, catch your breath, and aim to understand why. Is it purely a numbers issue, but that individual is bought on the reason that they buy in on that reason and they just don't have the money for it? That's one challenge, right? Maybe you can then plan for it in a future year. Or is it that they don't see the connection to corporate strategy and that they're not seeing the justification? That's a different issue entirely. That requires you to go back to the drawing board. And you may not win that argument this year, but it is a little bit of a reflection for you now to understand how you can do a better job of connecting it, the justification to business strategy. So that's really important. Be transparent. If the number looks high to you, say it. Say, this looks so expensive, and I realize that. However, it really is the cost of XYZ. You know, maybe you've done a little bit of homework, you've gotten some quotes. This was the average. Sometimes a budget is a place where you know something's going to get denied, but at least it's putting that placeholder in somebody's head for a future year. So maybe a security gap assessment this year is off the table. Justification's there, they understand it, but the money's just not there. Now they've seen the number. Now they have a bit of a placeholder in their mind, at least, where they realize, okay, like that's going to cost us something. So how do we make it happen for next year? What does that look like? What's that process? What kind of changes do you need to see in order for you to approve that for next year? So get ahead of anything that looks a little odd if the cost is high or maybe much lower. And that's something else that I think we're touching on that in a future slide about if costs go down because you've made your case to a certain provider. There's a couple pitfalls there, but always bring it back to core ideas and connect the dots for stakeholders. Be as transparent, narrative oriented as you can.
Awesome. Yeah, and we are going to cover that here in this slide. What are some tips you have for that editing process?
Sure. So, like we said before, if you are under certain mandates where operational expenditure has to be reduced by X amount this year, it must, right? Maybe that's the demand that you're getting. That's the requirement that's being communicated to you. Okay, right? You have to, right? Maybe there's not room for pushback on that. You may have to go back to your providers and say, how can I meet this cost, this price point? What do we have to do in order to get us to that lower price point? The thing that I would caution, I think a lot of providers are willing to work with you to get to a price point you want to see. Realize, however, that there's usually going to be an offset in the scope of that service as well. People don't give away services for free. So make sure you're going through that new contract that has the same price as last year, the year before, or 5 years ago. Look at the terms and conditions. You may very likely see a change in SLAs. You may very likely see that some of your services have been narrowed down a bit. Any company can help you meet a price point. You need to identify how they got there. What was the calculus behind that? And then you also need to just communicate that to your budgeting team and say, yep, I was able to do that. I was able to meet that price point. Here are the things that are now cut from that service. Because what I also see a lot is you get that savings up front, but maybe by doing that, you're now running the risk of overages in whatever the category is for that year. So it could be possible that you've met that need in your budget proposal. But if it turns out that you did it by kind of, capping the number of tickets that you get for a help desk, but in reality, you're going to generate the same amount of tickets you did last year, now you're running overages. And now you're probably blowing the OPEX mandate out of the water. So you need to also be transparent with your budgeting team as to the risks of meeting that budgeting requirement. And then, of course, you want to incorporate feedback. Your budget should have clear connections to your IT strategy, and your IT strategy should have clear connections to the overall business strategy. You work for a business, right? Everything has to roll up to the business strategy. You cannot be on your own IT island having your own strategy that is disconnected from the business. It just doesn't work well that way. You have to have what we call CIO, CEO alignment to make sure that everybody's goals are the same at a larger level.
So we've covered a ton of ground today, and I think some of the biggest takeaways are one, that your budget isn't just something that happens in August when budgeting season rolls around and you start to feel stressed about it. It's something that you're constantly preparing for, you're working off of. You said earlier that your budget should be your guide, and I thought that was really important. And second, even though budgeting is a numbers process, it's equally as much about what's on the page as the
Mhm,
steps you're taking off the page and the
mhm,
story that you're trying to tell there. So you need to connect your choices to the story that you're telling, and that story should be the story of supporting your organization.
mhm,
And if you need help getting there to that place where you're telling that story, where all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed, I'm happy to tell you that Data Prize has you covered. You can work with Tara. Like she said, give her a call if you want to work on some of those other use cases. You can work with her and her team to develop high quality and high performing budgets. We can guide you through the budgeting process with a workshop. We can work on more in depth budgeting engagements, or we can become your long term partners, developing your budget together annually and assisting with executing it to perfection. With that, I will say thank you, Tara, for hopping in as our resident expert today. We so appreciate your expertise on this process. Budgeting is frustrating for many people in IT, and I think you've given us some tips here for making that process so much easier. I'd also like to let everyone know that we will be sending out a copy of our IT budgeting workbook after the session today with the link to the recording and slides if you want to get to work on some of those tips that Tara shared with us today. So thank you for joining us from here. We're going to take some questions. We have just a few minutes here. We'll still try and get everyone out early. Let me look. Um, all right. What strategies do you use to quantify the value of intangible benefits like improved employee satisfaction or customer experience in your budget proposals?
mhm. That's a great question. So, especially things like improved employee satisfaction or customer experience. Like I said earlier, quantifying those things is better than the hypothetical of, we think it will improve employee satisfaction. There is research you can find that will tell you, um, when an employee departs a company, how big of a factor was their dissatisfaction with, the IT that was provided to them. That data exists. Um, you can start to get some of that data on your own. So you can send out surveys throughout the year. Some people are afraid to send those types of things out because they don't want to get low marks that they believe are reflective of their ability in IT. But don't think of it that way. Um, think about it as getting a baseline, right? You want to get that baseline after you complete a project. Um, Maybe send out another survey to your internal stakeholders and see if that changed. Did that move the needle? Those are important things that you can begin to quantify. So there's the data you can gather, there's market data, and make sure that you are factoring that in. There's things like employee productivity is measurable, um, and customer experience is also measurable. So there are ways to measure these things. If there are other teams within your company that are equipped to help you with that, definitely reach out to them. If HR is happy to help you run a survey internally to your staff to gauge their satisfaction across different, categories within IT, they can be a great way to help you gather that data. At DataPrize, we can help you with that too. We have run surveys for our customers that help give them those insights to their employee base to see if the way that they're managing IT is leading to things like employee retention and employee satisfaction. Um, Employee retention, uh, everyone has their eye on it because everyone knows the cost to recruit and train is more expensive than the cost to retain. most times. So, to the extent that you can keep your workforce happy and productive, you want to be able to assist with that. So, again, this ties back to try to tie it to those corporate strategies, quantify what you can, and always make sure that you're interpreting data correctly.
Awesome. Another question here. What are some of the pitfalls with just using last year's budget and adding 5%? How can I communicate to leadership that this isn't going to work?
Yeah. So, especially within the past few years, you've probably noticed massive increase in costs. Um, some vendors more than others. Some licensing models within major IT vendors have changed and become dramatically more expensive. So if you're just using, last year's expense plus 5% plus 10%, um, that's a little too arbitrary, and that accounts for maybe inflation, but probably not things like staff growth, licensing model changes, uh, feature needs. So I'll give an example, right? Microsoft licensing is an enigma to so many of us. And every year it's changing, and every year you need, some other license for this really in-demand feature set, and that's all okay. Microsoft is a tremendous partner and a tremendous vendor, but you have to have your eye on what those needs are, because adding 5% to last year, and this is an example, right? To last year's Microsoft spend might not cover the things that you want it to cover this year. Some of those features that were previously available on that license might now require a higher licensing. Um, don't forget too that over the years we have one company buy another company, right? So now that they're owned by a larger conglomerate, that licensing model may have changed too. Also realize the cost to maintain old equipment that is end of life, end of support, has cost associated to it. That's data that exists out there that's very compelling. The cost to service data, the security risk attached to having that liability of old infrastructure. That's important stuff. So that's a miss if you're just adding a certain percentage year over year. You're probably going to wind up with an overrun this year.
Awesome. And also, what story are you telling by just
Mhm.
taking last year's
Right,
story and then adding 5%? That
right.
sounds, you're rereading the same thing year after year
Yeah,
there.
yeah, absolutely. You wind up, you're reinforcing that idea that you're a cost center, and that you are just kind of a maintenance and upkeep provider. You do want to make sure that you are positioning yourself as a valued partner to your business, and that you are interpreting the business requirements and the business goals, and that you are matching those with associated initiatives and projects and spends.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be a little bit even tone deaf to just submit the same as budget as last year. If you haven't had the conversation with your business leaders about whether their business strategy is even the same as last year. Sometimes IT is the last to know. I see that so frequently, where IT learns of something way after the fact. It's not always IT's fault, because IT doesn't always have a seat at the table. But that is why you kind of have to take that added step of, you don't have to have a seat at the table if it's not culturally the right time, but you at least need to know what was discussed at that table, or else IT becomes an afterthought, to many times the company's own peril.
Mm-hmm. All right, and there's one more question we have submitted here. This
Mhm.
person says it's in the news that CIOs admit up to 30% of their IT spend is wasted. In your actual experience, what types of waste do you see? Is that an accurate number?
Oh, that's interesting. Um, So I probably don't have a direct answer for the accuracy of that number. But in terms of wasted IT spend, a lot of times we see that take the shape of either failed projects, where a large project is undertaken, but when it concludes, like I'm going to give an example, like maybe you implemented a large ERP, right, or a large like CRM, and maybe it's a failed implementation, not because your service provider didn't nail it, um, but because maybe the requirements weren't gathered right up front, and maybe no one uses the product, and that is a waste, right? Or if you cancel a project midstream, but you've already spent a certain amount on it, that happens. The other area we see it is with what we call shadow IT, shadow infrastructure. And for anyone not familiar with the term who's with us today, there's the IT you know about, and then there's the IT you don't know about. The IT you know about are the tools that are sanctioned by your IT department, promoted with your IT department. They have ownership of those tools. So an example, perhaps at your company, might be Microsoft Project. Maybe that's what your company is supposed to be using for project management. Well, maybe some other rogue team in the company has stood up a different PM tool. And maybe they are expensing that on a corporate credit card and it's being categorized totally differently. Or it is being tied back to your IT budget as something you didn't even know was going on and it's just slowly eating away at your budget. So those are two pretty different scenarios. But in terms of the budget you planned for and the budget that winds up wasted, so not the shadow IT, that's going to be a lot of failed projects or initiatives that didn't have the impact you thought that it would, and that you wind up either having to redo or abandon. That accounts for a lot of it. Now, funny enough, is if you prioritize up front business analysis, stakeholder involvement, requirements gathering. There are a lot of upfront things you can do to try to trim that waste. Another one is not doing proper workforce planning. So if you have a certain number of staff members within your IT department, but half of them sit idle for one reason or another, yeah, that's another wasted cost if you can't associate the work they're doing with any particular project or service item. So workforce planning is another one where you have to have a degree of workforce planning to understand what the demand is for your keeping the lights on stuff versus your innovative projects, stuff like that. But you do want to be able to do those things in order to control costs. That's a really, really good question.
Awesome. So that's all we have time for today. There are some more questions in here, and if we didn't get to your question, then we will follow up via email with some notes for you from our team. Thanks to everybody for joining today. Thank you again, Tara, for joining us. We so appreciate it. We hope that everybody on the line here learned something new, and we hope to see you on the next one. I'll go ahead and end this session. And just once again, thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks, everybody.